I'm going to go into fisheries, but there's so much involved in that. And I gave a class to the Rio Grande Valley chapter, and I started with the shrimp fishery, and I barely got finished with that. So I'm going to go into some other fisheries that we have here in Texas, and I probably won't get to the shrimp fishery, so I could come back sometime later on in the year if y'all want and talk about that. But we have several master naturalists in here that may have seen this presentation on the shrimp fishery already. I'm going to start out with the wild-caught oyster fishery. And the limit on the size of these oysters is about 2.5 inches in length. And the fishermen, I'm going to say fishermen because most of them are males in that fishery. And most of the people involved in the fisheries are males, except for I think I know one female that was catching black drum out of Port Mansfield, and I've known one that was fishing on a shrimp boat. But so I'll just refer to them primarily as fishermen. The oyster fishery that is down, it's got problems. Whenever we have a huge storm in the Gulf of Mexico that hits Texas or any portion of the Gulf Coast, oysters suffer because we get what is called a freshet coming down the rivers and making the bays fresh. Oysters cannot survive fresh water for very long. They need some salinity. In fact, I think one of their ideal salinities would be 5 parts per thousand or more. That means 0.5% or more salt in the water that they that they utilize. Oysters can filter anything out of the water pretty much that they can take in between their shell, and they filter each one filters about 50 gallons per day, and there are millions of oysters here in our area, and I'll show you a picture of one of the oyster beds. They have to have clean water for you to be able to eat the oysters from an area, and it has to be approved by the National Shellfish Sanitation Program. And each state is responsible for doing that sampling in accordance with the guidance of the National Shellfish Sanitation Program. So they have to do bacteria sampling so many times a year to be sure the water is clean. And we've had some problems recently with Galveston Bay. Galveston Bay produced some oysters in one area that went all the way to Florida, and some people got sick, and it was from what they call norovirus. So they can bring in viruses, polio virus. They can take in polio virus, or norovirus is the one that people get on cruise ships. Well, it popped up in the Galveston Bay too, and they had to recall like several 100,000, maybe 1 million sacks. I can't remember the exact number, but it was a lot. And the way they catch oysters is usually by what they call an oyster dredge. And I've got a picture. Can you all see my pointer? Okay. And they drag the dredge forever how long it takes them to fill up. They don't always catch just oysters. They catch a lot of shell. And then they have to sort through it. And that was an oyster boat that you saw there. This is another method that has become more common lately because our population of oysters has gone down with all the recent freshets that we've had. And harvesting or demand for oysters has actually increased. And so people will go out over some of these oyster beds and walk around the water and pick them up rather than dragging in the deeper water. Texas took notice of it this last year and closed 4 major areas for commercial harvesting of oysters. And it really hurt the fishery. But they say that it's important for those beds to come back and remain untouched pretty much because they're important for other things that live around these beds, such as sport fish. So we have over-harvesting, and our harvest has gone down quite a bit. These are the major bays. Galveston being the largest producer of oysters. Notice that the Lower Laguna Madre is not listed as a commercial bay. We do not have any oyster leases in this area, but we can go out and gather oysters here. Not commercially, but we can, I guess maybe we might be able to commercially, because they used to do that. But we cannot harvest them from areas that are not approved. So you can go online to the Texas State Health Commission, I believe that's the right name for it, and look up oyster harvesting areas that you can harvest the oysters from, and you can find out what areas that you could harvest them from in this area. I mentioned earlier that they serve as biofilters. They can filter 50 gallons a day. This is just north of San Martin Bridge, the San Martin Bridge that we cross going towards Brownsville. And these are two major oyster beds. And Dr. Hudson Dio with UTRGV has done a study of these, and this is a major drain from Brownsville. So a lot of bacteria and other things come down that area into the Brownsville ship channel. And he found out that I think as much as 30% or more of the bacteria and nutrients are removed by the oysters in this area. You cannot eat oysters from this area because most of the water coming down has high bacteria counts.
Alameda water supply also drains there.
The what?
Alameda water supply.
Olmita water supply?
So
They dry.
he tests the water in front of the oysters and behind the oysters?
Yes, he tested them upstream and downstream, but he had to do it with the tides because when the tide comes in, it's coming from the ship channel. When it goes out, it's coming from Brownsville.
So when you go to someplace like Joe's or Tortugo's, where do they get their oysters?
Probably now, maybe from out of state or from somewhere in Texas. I've seen oysters from New York along the Texas coast. Because they're at a premium right now, some people are paying as much as $3 for an oyster.
Wow.
And when you eat them raw, you're taking a risk, no matter what. I used to love to eat them raw, right off the oyster beds, and I don't do that anymore. Adrian?
Right now you're saying local oysters are not safe to eat.
No, they are.
Okay.
Laguna Madre, but this is
Not
San Martin Lake.
Okay.
Yeah. San Martin Lake is a major drainage from
We'll
Brownsville.
put that in the meeting minutes.
So if you go out in Laguna Madre, if you look for
Tony
those
says.
charts,
And our restaurants are accountable. If you ask where their oysters come from, just like shrimp, they have to tell you.
or they have,
Or
if you
tags.
if you buy oysters, you're right, they have a tag in them. If you buy them in the shell, and they have a tag associated with each box or bag that you buy, and it says where they came from and when they were harvested. So you can save that, and if you get sick, you can let people know and they'll warn other people. So now recently Texas is allowing growing oysters, and these oysters in this picture were actually grown in the Laguna Madre. But my son just recently gave a presentation, and he works for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, but he used to be with Texas A&M Corpus Christi, and he said that the Laguna Madre is really not a good place to try to grow oysters for consumption in aquaculture or mariculture situations, because we don't really have the food availability for the oysters, and the regulations that they have for putting in an aquaculture facility are extremely difficult to meet down here, because the lower Laguna Madre is covered 80%, almost 80%, maybe less, in seagrasses, and you cannot locate, I think, within 500 feet of a seagrass bed. Oysters, they'll produce what they call pseudo-feces and feces. So they make a lot of material that will accumulate underneath where they're growing, because they usually grow them up in the water column in baskets. And so that'll accumulate, and it can actually kill seagrasses. So they don't want you putting them in that area. And you have to grow them in an approved growing area too. These are currently where we have farms off the Texas coast or along the Texas coast. We've got, I guess, 4 major areas: Texas Oyster Ranch in Copano, Texas Sustainable Oysters in Galveston, DJ's in Matagorda Bay, and the AgriLife Oyster Hatchery is just a hatchery. They're not doing grow outs, but they're going to be able to supply oysters to aquaculture growers in the near future, probably this year. And then the Palacios Marine Agriculture Research Area is located further up in Palacios, and they've done some demonstration grow outs there. And I love this. This is one of my favorite quotes about oysters. I think they're delicious, and it is like kissing the sea on the lips. How many of you like oysters?
I do, but I don't know.
Who doesn't like oysters? A few. You're smart, because they do take in everything that's out there that they can. This is my favorite oyster recipe. My wife makes it. It's called Oysters Mexicali, and it has cheese, chili peppers, and I think it's about cheese, chili peppers, and butter maybe, and maybe a little bit of wine. But oh, it's so good, and she broils that. And I like them cooked, because if there's something really bad in it, possibly it'll get killed. The blue crab fishery is an interesting one. We've got 6 blue crab fishermen here in the lower Laguna Madre area, and they've had a tough time, not because of lower salinity, but because of high salinity in the water in the lower Laguna Madre. 2 years ago, they would pull up their crab traps, and they would take the crabs out, and they'd put them in cold water to slow their metabolism down, but they would die after that happened. They couldn't figure out why until they opened one up and they found these things in them. These are barnacles, gooseneck barnacles, a parasitic gooseneck barnacle that actually attaches to the gills. The gills, my mother used to call them the dead man's fingers inside the crab. And what they do is they interfere with respiration of the crabs. And most of the crabs that are caught here are sent to Maryland, to the Baltimore area, because they have such a huge demand for blue crabs there. So when the salinity eased up, when we had some rain, they started surviving better. But blue crab production has gone down significantly. It's like all over the the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, and they can't. It's a mystery. They can't really figure out why.
So the gooseneck barnacles grow in the high salinity?
Yes, they prefer high salinity area, and they don't just affect these crabs. They found them in other crabs. Gooseneck barnacles. You ever find something floating and then they're attached to it? These are just a different species, and it was really weird. I never had any idea that would happen. I took this picture and I went, wow.
Soft shell crabs, what's the deal with them?
Crabs grow by shedding their shell, and usually in the springtime they shed their shells. And in Louisiana, they'll put out brush in certain areas so the crabs can go into that area and be protected and shed their shells. That's how they grow. They'll pop out of it, and then the shell starts hardening. So there are some facilities that crabbers will bring crabs to them that have certain markings on them. They call them red line or white line on the shell where they're getting ready to shed, and they'll shed them out in there, and then they'll freeze them immediately so they stop hardening. And that's what soft shell crabs are.
That's how you eat a soft shell crab.
That's how you eat a soft shell crab. Of course, you remove the dead man's fingers and the guts too, and the eyes. And my mother used to fry them. Oh God,
yeah,
they're good.
Very good.
I love seafood. You should eat it twice a week if you want to stay healthy. In February coming up, we're going to have a time when 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 all of the traps have to be out of the water in Texas, and then people go out and actually look for abandoned crab traps and pick them up. Can anybody figure out why you shouldn't leave a crab trap in the water that's
Well,
unattended?
it's dangerous for one thing.
What?
It's dangerous because boats could run over
It is dangerous. Boats can run over it.
It'll keep collecting crabs and they
Yes,
die.
it'll be what they call a ghost trap. And bait fishermen can end up catching them in their nets, and that messes with their catch or their income. So it's a good thing to have that, and they've removed over 40,000 traps. Wow. Since 2002, I think. We also have a longline fishery off of Texas, and what they catch primarily are swordfish and tuna fish. And then in the bay, we also have a type of longline. I'll get to that in a minute too. But this is what it looks like. It has more drop in the line, and they can be like 20 to 30 miles long. And the Japanese were fishing the Gulf of Mexico in the 1970s, and they were fishing lines as much, I think, as 100 to 200 miles long, and they would take everything they caught, even billfish. If our longliners pick up a billfish, they have to cut it off and release it. That's called bycatch, when you catch something you're not fishing for. I mentioned swordfish. They catch swordfish. This one weighed about 500 pounds. One of the first things they do is cut the bill off because the boats are constantly moving. And I knew a guy that got one stuck through his calf. And it's extremely painful. They're rough. Swordfish feed by swimming through a school of fish and swinging their sword back and forth. And the sword is 1/3 the total length of that fish. So it's pretty dangerous. They also eat shrimp on the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, and when they do that, it turns the meat pink. Most of the time it's a whitish color, but every once in a while you get one that's pink colored, and that's really something that people are extremely interested in because it's different. Every once in a while we'll see bites from what is called the cookie cutter shark. And we had a whale wash up on the coast here on South Padre Island about 10 years ago. And its baby also washed up too. And she had 500 of these bites on the side of it. And we don't know whether she was attacked afterwards or during or when she was alive. But what did it was the cookie cutter shark. And what it stays perpendicular in the water, and it bioluminesces. So it attracts fish in the dark, usually at night, or in the deep water. And when something comes in like a swordfish, it rushes in and bites it, and they think it flicks its tail and takes out a bite like an ice cream scoop. And I'll go back if I can. Previous, there we go. And you can see those. Those are the, like ice cream. They probably should have called it the ice cream scoop shark instead of a cookie cutter. But they're really nasty looking fish, and they've been known to attack people swimming in the Hawaiian Islands, between islands. I would hate to have that happen, but I'm afraid of sharks anyway. So.
Shows you've got some sense.
Yeah. So I mentioned that we do have a type of longline in our Laguna Madre and pretty much all around the coast of Texas. And it's used to fish for black drum, which are an extremely popular fish. Black drum like to eat oysters, by the way. And one year back in the 1970s, there were so many black drum, Parks and Wildlife was worried about the oyster population. So they said no limit, you can take them and you can fish as long as you want and catch as many as you want. And hopefully it saved quite a few oysters. But it's called a trot line, and they use pieces of dowel. They'll cut a 1/4 inch of maybe 1/4 inch to 5/8 inch dowel and put it on a hook. And redfish will come up and bite it. I think, Linda, you Probably Mike has seen them out there, or you've probably seen them out there. Linda, you have too?
My son-in-law used to do that.
Yeah,
And they use-
but they don't just catch black drum, they catch other fish too, but they have to let those go, most of them go.
What's dial? What does they use?
A dowel rod, D-O,
Okay, a rod without,
W-
they don't even have to put
a
anything
wooden
in it.
rod, and they just slice off discs of it.
And so they don't need any live bait, they just, perfect.
I don't think they can use live bait on it. I think there's limits. I didn't really look that up, but also offshore they use bottom long lines, and they catch fish such as this one, the golden tilefish. It looks like a Peter Max fish when it's fresh. Look it up, Google it, because they're really beautiful if you can see a fresh one. And they're good to eat, but they're high in mercury, extremely high in mercury, like swordfish, and there's warnings on even eating them. I mentioned you also catch tuna fish on surface long lines or just below the surface. And the most common fish that we catch are yellowfin tuna. Yellowfin is probably the most common tuna fish that we have out in the Gulf of Mexico. There are some relatives out there. Bonita are a type or a member of the tuna family, but people don't eat them because they think it's real bloody meat. But in other countries, they do consume them.
It's big in China.
What?
It's big in China,
Is it?
yeah.
And there's also a smaller tuna that we have out there. What is the smaller one? The name escapes me right now. Can't think of it. I'll think of it in a few minutes. But bumblebee tuna looked at them, but they were too high in mercury. Smaller tuna have less mercury, and women of childbearing age should even look at restricting their consumption of tuna fish at certain time.
Well, you did some research.
I did my master's on tuna, or not on tuna, but on mercury in most of the fishes that we have here. And we're doing pretty good. We don't have real high concentrations. Mercury is out there. It's caused by volcanoes. Every time you drive your car, you're contributing to it. Every time fuel is burned, it contributes to it. Mining operations, burning of coal, it's ubiquitous. And you just need to be careful of what you eat, especially if you're of childbearing age and female. The bluefin, well, I'm sorry, this is a yellowfin tuna, and this is how they grade them. They grade them 1s, 2s, or 3s, and they look at the coloration. If it's a cherry color meat, and then they'll put in a rod that's hollow, and they'll take out a core sample, and they'll squeeze it to see how it gives. And if it's a fatty fish, it's very springy, just like probably any fat. And if it's springy enough, it makes a #1 grade, and that gives the highest price for the fish. So they grade those fish. We also have another species offshore, and it is the largest of the tuna fish, and I think they get up to something like almost 1,500 pounds. I think it's 1,496 pounds is the world record. The bluefin tuna, they can swim as fast as 55 miles an hour. And the biggest price for one that I'm aware of so far was $3.1 million, or over $5,000 a pound. And that was in Japan, and it was sold at the Tsukiji market there. And they do catch them, but they're regulated. You can only catch maybe one as bycatch and keep it. If you catch any others, you have to let them go. Sometimes you can catch 2, just extremely regulated.
Nationwide or just in Texas? Is that a Texas rule? Or
That's Gulf-wide.
Gulf, okay, because our son-in-law fishes for him in Maine, and I know there's a season and there's limits up there.
There is, and they fish primarily out of sport fishing boats for those. And they're allowed to catch so many, and they do get good prices for them.
But may or may not pay for your fuel.
That's right. Fuel. Well, that's been a big problem with anyone fishing now.
Yep.
We've known that our snapper boats don't go out as far. Our shrimp boats, they sometimes would go to Louisiana, and now they're just going out here.
Yeah.
catching smaller shrimp. Fuel is the biggest problem. That's a very good point in fisheries, period. And then we had an orca pod appear, I think it was in 1987, off of here, and there were about 6 of them, 6 or 8, I don't remember how many. But the people that documented it were fishing for tuna, and they were catching a lot of yellowfin right when the orcas appeared. So evidently the orcas were chasing the tuna, trying to eat them. But they don't just eat tuna fish. They've documented them eating the largest whale, or attacking and killing the largest whale, the blue whale off of Australia. And we've got hundreds of them in the Gulf of Mexico. There were some guys on an oil rig, I think off the Louisiana and Texas line, that reported seen several hundred at one time, orcas. And I didn't even think they were in the Gulf when I first came over here in the 80s, yes.
A friend of mine on the island, her boyfriend has a huge boat, and they were out a couple of months ago and saw a pot of orcas.
Wow.
Very cool.
Yeah, Lena's got that video when she went offshore, a few years ago of a pod.
Yeah, it's amazing that,
3 years ago, when I was on the All In, we saw one.
wow. I've never seen one out there. I've seen other whales, but never that one. And it's really, I don't know, it just seems unusual. They must be, maybe it's climate change, because it hadn't been reported that I was aware of before that. We do have a gillnet fishery off of here. It's not our fault. It's Mexico. And it's caused a lot of trouble. The Coast Guard and Texas Parks and Wildlife have to enforce it. Gillnetting is not allowed in Texas waters. And almost every week you can see a story about fishermen that were fishing gillnets, or long lines too. The Mexicans fish long lines. And this is what they look like off Baghdad Beach. If they get seized, and this is a shot of illegal netting. I'm sorry it's real grainy, but I took this off of a video that I took when I was fishing off Boca Chica, and these guys were fishing a gillnet in extremely shallow water, right in the surf, and it was illegal. If they catch them, they seize the boat, the motor, and they arrest the fishermen, but then they let them go, and they go back to Mexico. And they say that, and there was an article in Texas Monthly a few months ago. They said that the cartels will buy them a new boat, motor, and nets, or long lines, to go back fishing again, because evidently they're also used for smuggling. And it's they say that our causeway is one of the major pipelines for drug smuggling here in South Texas.
This causeway?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh dear.
Well, that's the only way they can get across, unless they maybe get a boat, and it's pretty shallow to get up on the other side. Richard Moore called me a few months ago, I think it was in October, and said there was a gillnet on Boca Chica, and there were 5 green sea turtles that had drowned in it. And it's really a major issue. The Coast Guard station, last time I looked, had 15 of those vessels, and they have to destroy them too. And that's not recyclable too. It's a real problem. Because of that, the U.S. has restricted Mexican fishing vessels from coming into U.S. ports. When they did that, I saw a lot of Mexican boats that were leaving our port because they utilize our port to get repairs and buy fuel. And they can't, so it's hurt the people that do that on our side. It's an extreme, I don't know what the answer is, because
Well, then they're gonna start restricting us from going into their ports.
I don't think so.
Well, if we have a storm or something, they could.
Well, I'm sure if we have a storm, they'll let them in too, because there are certain rules that apply. When lives are in danger, they can seek safe harbor. So many of y'all are probably aware the restoration of Bahia Grande has completed. We now have over 200 feet, a 200-foot wide channel that supplies the Bahia with seawater, but the upper reaches of it are still hypersaline. Dr. David Hicks told me the other day, and because of that, we might need some more water coming in from other spots. So that may be in our future. Whether they can afford it or not, we'll see. But I would like to see it happen.
Where's the channel that brings the water in?
Yes. Where is it? It's on Highway 48. First, when you're going toward Port Isabel out of Brownsville, you cross the San Martin Bridge, and then you cross the Bahia Grande. It's called the Carl Joe Gaiman Bridge.
Where do you think they would cut in through?
I would like to see them cut one in from the north, from the Laguna Madre, and because when you'd have northers, water would pour in, but that's some valuable property right there. So we may not see it. We may see it come in from Vidilla Ancha, which is another area along the Brownsville Ship Channel that goes in to the Little Laguna Madre, and then there's another body of water that is all connected to the Bahia Grande. And I'll show you the Bahia Grande, the changes that we've seen over the years before the Brownsville Ship Channel and afterwards. We lost a lot of wetlands. And a biologist in the 1930s predicted that we would see a decline in fisheries production in the future because we were filling so many wetlands. And we have seen it. The Lower Laguna Madre was one of the most productive estuaries along the Texas coast, but now we're lagging behind. And that may be one of the reasons. And I'll stop there. Oh, I was going to go into recreation, but I think I've taken enough time. So.
Thank you, Tony.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Thanks.